All right, I think we're good to go. So, and maybe not even with our traditional complaint about Twitter Spaces, although it doesn't feel right to not complain about it. So I don't know.
I don't know. Worked pretty good last week. Let's hope for the best, or whatever.
Of course, because I'm saying that it's going to really be a disastrous week. So, Adam, you want to describe how we got here? Because you had a tweet over the weekend that I think got us here.
Yeah. So let's see. So there's every so often. Steve can tell me how often because I don't keep track. There's a new Rust release, and then on Twitter, because I've been following more and more of the right folks, folks get excited about like little here and there details. And one of the things in the most recent Rust release is let chains. So in Rust, you can say if let and then a pattern equals some variable. And it was sort of annoying in the past where if you wanted to do many of these things, you had to sort of nest them deep, which was annoying, or you had to put a match, which was kind of ugly. And now you can do a Rust chain. So a let chain. So that was an example of just like some nice thing that came along without, from my perspective as a dumb user of Rust, it just kind of fell from space onto my lap and now I get to use it. And I feel like that happens a bunch. And it's one of the things I enjoy about Rust.
Yeah, amen. And I think so. Well, we talked about this specific feature because, Steve, this has been in the works for a long time.
Correct. Can you hear me? I don't know if my microphone is on my phone or if it's on my headphones.
Yeah, we got you.
Okay, cool.
Were you? Yeah.
Just like, this feature, I don't remember exactly how long, but it definitely was talked about for a while. And that was like for a couple of different reasons. But in general, like this is like part of if let was like originally kind of taken from Swift in the first place. And my understanding is that Swift has had a similar feature for kind of a long time. So there was some amount of precedent, but my recollection was there was a lot of talk about the exact syntax that should be used. And that kind of like held it down for a little while because this is not like a particularly complicated feature semantically, but making sure that you got all your ducks in a row could take some time. So yeah, totally. It like took a little while, but it's here, and that's cool.
And I would say one of the things that is a huge time waster for me, say like late Friday evenings or whatever, is getting deep into some of these Rust features that feel like I really want them, like let chains or like having traits have async within them.
Yeah.
There's stuff like that some of them just feel like, oh, like this is a kind of simple feature where we're dealing with some of the esoteric details. And some of them are just huge, deep rabbit holes where people have literally been talking about them for 6 years. And the level of complexity associated with them, it just boggles the mind.
Definitely.
And I feel that, if let is one of those, like it is not simple if the let chains is definitely not simple. There's a lot of edge conditions and it was interesting because did you go back to the history of this thing at all? It's been around for 4+ years.
No, I had been through the history of it, one of the like 10,000 times I had needed it, but I've not like refreshed my memory on that.
It was just interesting in terms of like the odyssey that a feature like this goes on. And I, for one, actually, I know that odyssey is extraordinarily frustrating, probably for all involved. But for us, those who actually are the like Rust users, it's I really appreciate the odyssey because they really make sure that they're not breaking things. I think, Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, but it just seems that breakage of existing crates is taken really, really, really serious. People do not want to break existing crates.
Definitely. That's the whole point. Like we run this test suite of all of crates.io as part of the release process. Like it's important.
Which is, I have to tell you, is great. Just like the level, because I feel like this is not always the case with just software in general. I think often there's not a great deal of empathy with the users, frankly. And it feels like if someone wants to do something and they're kind of, loud enough, they can make it happen in a lot of communities. And that doesn't really seem to be true at Rust. It seems to be that there's like a lot of really thoughtful discourse on these things. And I'm sure it is like frustrating for most people most of the time, but the artifact, the result of that is really, really good, I feel.
Yeah, there's definitely a super huge balance. There's a number of people who have like burned out and quit over the years because of this being so onerous, and like it is definitely true. I think something that we see a lot more It's kind of happening a little bit lately in some cases, but what I see in other places, I mean, like literally, like Guido stepped down from being the BDFL of Python because he added a feature that he really wanted, and everybody hated him about it, and he was just sick of taking shit from people. So like, this is definitely a thing that happens in programming language communities in general. And actually, ironically, the like stability thing, one place that takes that like stronger than you may normally assume is like Ruby is like actually very weirdly stable in a lot of ways.
Huh. That is surprising. I don't mean to sound pejorative. But that is
totally.
Surprising.
There's a feature in Ruby called flip flops. I don't know if you've ever heard of this feature or not. You basically like you have a range and you use a triple dot, and what happens is as iteration happens, it goes from like returning false to then when it gets within the range, it starts returning true, and then outside it starts returning false again. This is a Perlism that like got put in Ruby that like never got taken out. And so when it was time to talk about like Ruby 2.0, somebody filed a bug that was like, hey, we should finally remove flip-flops. And the people were like, well, does anyone know if this feature is being used by anyone? And Yatsuke Endo, if I remember correctly, was like, I'm actually one of the users of flip-flops. For example, this. And he posted a quine written in Ruby that relied on flip-flops. And
this is a load-bearing quine. People.
Yes. And so Matt's went, cool, seems like people are using this. Never mind, we're not going to remove it and close the bug. So,
okay, so
like,
Steve, you should explain what I mean. You should explain what a quine is. If folks don't know what a quine is.
Sure. So a quine is a program that prints its own source code, basically. And you can also have variants like this. Well, the reason I remember that it's Yatsuke Endo is because he is like kind of semi-notorious for making a lot of these quines. And one of the ones that he did previously was a, like, I think it's called a 7 quine. It's how you determine like the number of iterations. So step 1, print step 2, print step 3, and then print 7, print step 1 again. So it's kind of like that kind of quine. He did one where it looks like a globe that rotates through those 7 steps. So when it gets back to the start again, like that's what it's like. So
wait.
Like,
is he the one who did the 100
yes.
language quine relay?
Correct,
okay,
yes.
So Adam, do you know anything about this? The 100 language quine relay?
You told me about this probably like maybe like 8 years ago, something like that.
Yes, good memory, because we used it to test LX. So we done a Linux personality for SmartOS, and it was delightful to discover this now 128 language quine relay. So quine relay is, just as Steve is describing, is a program that generates another program as output. That program generates another program, and so on and so forth. And then the 128th program generates the first program as output, which is extraordinary. And it actually causes us to debug some really gnarly bugs in some very strange languages called, I want to say is it G Portugal? R Portugal. There's a language that's in Portuguese for which all the documentation is in Portuguese, the keywords are in Portuguese, everything about it is in Portuguese. And we had a super esoteric linker issue. But Steve, this thing was amazing. This quine relay was amazing.
Yeah, I'm going to triple check this. I'm like 99% sure that it was.
Well, the person who did this was definitely...
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Because there are a bunch of like... Because I'm like, how do you do this? And there is an issue where someone's like, hey, look, like I'm a researcher, and you've kind of like addressed like an open research question, and I'm very curious how you did this. Can you describe your methodology here? And then he like closes the issue out with like the cherry blossoms are out in Tokyo, closed.
Yep.
And you're just like, okay, is this potentially like an alien life form? Is this from this? I mean, it's amazing. It's otherworldly. So the fact that this person needs an operator does not mean that everyone needs it, I think is the moral of the story. I think that's
true. Yeah.
And the flip flop is, did you ever use it in actual code, Steve? I'm still trying to understand like when I would actually want that behavior.
Yeah, it's I forget why like it was originally put in Perl or whatever, but it's something about just like when you need to do certain kinds of range operations, then it's useful for. I don't know. I've never used it for anything important.
But the fact that it's got Perl origins is definitely interesting, because I would contrast kind of Perl, certainly back in the day, where it just felt like it would add abstraction really quickly without necessarily thinking about the longer term consequences. And then it became a language that had so much abstraction that it became unreadable at some level because someone could always use a different abstraction to do the same thing.
I remember using this in Perl.
This was not super uncommon to use this in Perl. And it like the utility is you can say things like, does this number match within this range? Like, does this IP address match within this range of permitted IP addresses for something?
Huh.
That was a very like Perl-esque use for this.
Interesting. So, but that's interesting that they. So, in terms of the way, I guess. So, Steve, the moral of the story was not the Quine Relay. It was that the way that Ruby dealt with a feature being used versus the way that Rust thinks about it. I mean, were you contrasting that to the Rust community?
No, I was saying that I think that it's like different languages have different attitudes towards stability, and Rusts tend to be extremely on that way. And I think some languages, even if they have the perception for being the other way, at times will be conservative. Like you can't always say that a language like is super stable or is not in all circumstances, because like it just really kind of like depends. And so like Rust tends to take stable features really seriously, but unstable features change all the time. And like, yeah, unstable features aren't in the language proper yet, but like the point is there's a mechanism for language developers to like care and not care, and it's clearly divided in Rust by the tooling. But other languages also do this kind of thing. They just don't necessarily have that distinction. And so it can feel like they break a lot of things when sometimes maybe they like don't break something you don't notice, as opposed to they do break something that you do notice or whatever.
Yeah, that's interesting. In terms of like, because Rust really does have first-class support for experimental features.
Right. That's, I think, the difference is that like it exists, is part of the language mechanism to be able to separate this statically and also like cleanly to know what things you're using and not using.
It's such a lovely mechanism to both have that extremely strict, like well thought out process for evolving the language, but then also have the like nightly YOLO, do whatever you want. Like I'm sure there's more strictures than that, but to have those opportunities, I think like you can't have one without the other. Like to have that strict process, almost in order to build that language and do it accretively, like requires that avenue for exploration. Yeah,
and then you also you can get some real experience using some of these features, and that experience can also be. I mean, do you remember our misadventures with the exclusive range operator in match patterns, Adam?
No.
So there is a still, I believe, experimental feature for. So Rust has the exclusive versus inclusive range pattern, but the match syntax forces you to use the inclusive range pattern if you're going to use a range pattern in a match arm. Steve, please correct me if I get any of this stuff wrong.
I believe that's true. This is like, I actually don't use exclusive ranges very often or inclusive ranges very often, so I'm not as familiar with the specific details of some of the syntax. But yeah, you're totally right. There's something there. Yeah.
Right. And so you actually, but in a match pattern, I mean, well, I feel like in a match pattern, I don't very often use ranges just full stop. But in a match pattern, you have to have inclusive ranges. There is no support for exclusive ranges. And we had, I don't know if you remember this, Adam, but we had a bug in Talk super early on in Oxide that was because the problem is if you support both inclusive and exclusive range patterns in a match arm, it's really easy to screw that up. And Talk had screwed this up in one place and then cut and pasted it everywhere. And it's like kind of hard to read it's hard to like, you have to be just very, I think, not just Rust literate, but you have to know that like the double dots is always the exclusive range pattern. And this should be double dots equals to match the intent of the programmer. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Now I do remember this. Yeah. And they had enabled some nightly feature.
They had enabled and I'm like, I don't understand how this code is broken. And then I'm like, oh, they've enabled this nightly feature. They've misused it everywhere. And it's interesting because like this is one of the very few like language issues that I've kind of been involved in, but only as like, hey, I want to give this this kind of report from the field that a project turned it on and misused it everywhere. And people should probably think carefully before. enabling it. And that comment was like hugely downvoted. People were just like, burn him.
He's a witch.
He's a witch. But what's interesting is that I'm like, look, I just think you want to be very careful because there's no way Lint is not going to find this because these are two separate programmer intents. And I'm just like, I think it's dated. But what's interesting is like then to watch that discussion kind of happen over the years. And because the other thing that I love is that Rust, the Rust compiler will vector you to an open issue on something that is like germane. And the Rust compiler, if you try to use an exclusive range pattern, the Rust compiler will be like, oh no, you can't use an exclusive range pattern in a match arm. And here's the issue that's open for it. And over the years, and this just happened like this afternoon, but every like once in a while, someone weighs in on that issue being like, the fact that this is not in the compiler just saved my butt because I was about to like have a bug basically.
Yeah.
And I think that is, I mean, obviously I've got feelings about this particular issue, but I think like the meta issue of allowing people to experiment with nightly features for better and for ill, and then offer feedback on that and have the compiler kind of aware that, oh, by the way, there's this, what you're using is actually, there's an experimental feature for this. And I think it's actually great in terms of the way that engenders discussion and feedback.
It is also important, though, I think the point that was made a minute ago, that also this is like tied to not being unstable until it is allowed to be unstable is actually really critical, though. And because we actually have an existence proof of the downsides of this, I'm going to pick on Haskell for like just a minute here. Haskell has language pragmas that you can basically turn on features in the language. And this was like kind of my understanding, I'm not a super expert on the Haskell development process, but my understanding was this was part of the like, we're not sure if we're ready for this feature to truly exist in the language yet or not. So they're turning it on as like an extension. There's also some weirdness between like Haskell, the language definition, and Haskell is actually implemented by compilers, but like that's a whole separate sort of thing. But anyway, the point is that you can turn on those features in a stable compiler and like use them. And this leads to an explosion of dialects where some people turn on some sets of features in all their projects and other ones don't. And this can also be kind of a problem because there's no guarantee that they'll work well with each other. And so sometimes like somebody will, land their favorite feature they've been working on for their PhD thesis or whatever, and then kind of like abandon it, and it bit rots a little teeny bit, or like doesn't work in some combination with this other feature because nobody did. How do you test the combinatorial explosion of which sets of these features are turned on versus not? It's just like a hard engineering problem. And so that happens because people in the same stable can end up using those things, and it leads to a lot of like fragmentation in my understanding. That's what I've heard and observed people talking about. So I do think that both parts are really important. The being able to have a way to try this stuff out and get it in people's hands, while also being like, most people can't do that. Like, you have to explicitly opt into it, I think is like really significant.
Yeah, that's actually a really important point. Because, sorry, Adam, go ahead.
Oh, Steve, I was wondering, from my perspective, some of these issues I dive deep on. Like, for example, when like ASM was going to be in stable, I was definitely sitting there refreshing the GitHub issue. Like, I know that this is like ridiculous, but like I was like, okay, well, another checkbox got checked. Like we're 4 out of 5. Like, we're gonna get there. Very excited.
It's like you were watching like Apollo 13 return to safely.
Other people were watching like SpaceX or whatever, but this was totally,
you're watching Chasm land.
This is my Falcon Heavy. Yeah, exactly. So. But I gotta say, look, I don't have a lot of visibility into like what the process, like when how does something go from a goofball experimental feature or something that is in flight to something people are using, to then folks getting the cabal, the council of elders saying, okay, now let's make a push, let's get this across the line. And again, without maybe the gritty details of how a bill becomes law, but just what's the general like how does something get enough momentum to get across the line?
want to think about what I want to say.
Totally
here.
fair. Totally fair. I realize that's a charged
Steve, you
question.
sound as if like Adam's trying to bribe you. Like,
no.
Listen, I'm trying to give a favorite charity.
I'm not a cop or anything.
I'll do it this way. The fact that you don't know that is a problem in the process that there has not been a lot of appetite for solving lately. And so I myself don't really fully know how that works anymore because things have changed. And so I have not been able to keep up with the way in which they have changed.
Wow. It is amazing that you constructed that whole sentence without using the letter E. That was that was remarkable. No, I get it. My apologies, Steve, for kind of putting you on the spot there. But I do think
part of it, the way I can say it a little bit more is like in the old days, what we used to do is have all our comments on GitHub threads so you could find them. And now it's all buried in Zulip threads, which are like impossible to read and find. And I think is like a problem for the Rust development process. But the language team enjoys sequestering themselves away from everyone else. So that's just the way that it is how I actually feel about it.
And so I guess I do have some sympathy for that because it may be that like being fully in the open may be distracting, and especially as you get some threshold of popularity, like having people jabber at you about some particular feature, disagree with you about some particular feature being ready or not ready, again, may be distracting. So maybe that's overly generous.
That is definitely one good reason to do it that way, for sure.
Okay.
I mein, hearing that discussion is buried in a Zulip thread is like that. What the cartoon about React? I mean, did you just tell me to go fuck myself? It's like I definitely did, Bob. It feels like that's not going to be very. But I can understand why that's both frustrating, but I can also understand. I mean, that's not totally nonsensical too. I can understand.
Yeah,
why.
The being public, like what Adam said a minute ago, everything being really public is a problem for a lot of people and does lead to burnout. So I'm not necessarily saying that it is universally better, but there's some sort of back and forth balance here, and over time it has swung in different directions. And I'm a little less charitable than I used to be, so that's just like the way that it goes. But it is actually a real problem, and I'm not going to say that I think that GitHub issue threads are the be all end all like way to design a thing. It's just like I don't know. I just always think back to like the advice for remote first work is like don't make decisions in chat, make them in writing, and like. I wonder how many of those threads will disappear someday. Like the RFC's repo is like this rich history of programming language development. I've cited the remove the runtime RFC to like so many people over the years. And so, I want that stuff to like survive. And it is not clear to me how that happens in a world where all the relevant discussion is on Zulip.
That repo is so valuable.
It's so valuable, yeah.
And also just like has nerve sniped me in so many ways and kind of broken my heart in some ways. Brian, I don't know if you've had this happen where like you have fallen in love with some RFC, kind of like gone 15, 20 threads deep in it, only to find it sort of petered out in like 2019, and like the people who were championing it sort of moved on, or that it's just some like ludicrously fucking complex thing like generic associated types or something like that, where you realize, okay, this is actually a ways off.
Yeah, the features that have broken my heart, that's kind of interesting because I feel that, and maybe this is where I'm just like a very meat and potatoes Rust programmer, that the stuff that I get most excited about seems to be the stuff that lands.
You're on Nightly and Hubris too, so like. But
we're on Nightly only out of necessity, and in fact, I actually have an open PR to literally whitelist or allow list the features specifically so that we don't add more of them because we actually don't want to be accumulate. We're trying to get unstable as soon as we can. We just can't because there's required stuff for OS development that's not stable yet.
Right.
Well, actually, Steve, this is something I want to say too. That because I think you made a very good point about it is good that you can't be unstable and use an experimental feature, because it also puts pressure on those people that are using experimental features like us. I mean, Adam, that's part of the reason you're clicking reload and watching the moon landing of ASM hit. Because, like, speaking for Hubris, like, we definitely needed stable ASM. Like, we absolutely needed. There's a bunch of stuff that we needed, and that was a big one. I don't know, Steve. What else are we using in Hubris?
The big thing that's not immediately being stabilized is naked functions.
Right.
Makes sense.
So there's that.
The
There's,
stabilization PR for that out, actually. It just,
oh, sweet.
Yeah, but it seems to have stalled, the PR, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Well, there's my heartbreaker, Adam. You're asking about the heartbreaker. That might be it.
Totally. But ASM and naked functions were the big ones. Somebody briefly snuck in, what's the destructuring assignments, but that's been stabilized since. And so, we're technically not, as of my other PR, we won't be having that as an unstable feature soon once I update the toolchain. But that got snuck in there briefly. There is a CMOS something whatever feature that's required as part of the LPC 55 shenanigans that has to happen. I don't remember, as part of Laura's work on the root of trust stuff, needs a nightly feature that's specific to something that's deep platform support. But that's really it. Naked functions and inline ASM were the two big features that were really necessary. And we're technically still we're using the two of the sub features of inline assembly, ASM const and ASM sim. Sim is being stabilized or has been called for stabilization right now. I don't know where const is at though. Yeah.
Called for stabilization in a Zoop thread that we're not in, but hopefully we're on that distant planet. I hope that the Council of Elders sees it rules in our favor.
I think it'll be good.
Adam, with that.
Yeah, sorry. May I interrupt? Hi, I, as an interested observer rather than someone with anything enlightened to say, it feels like also there are multiple councils of elders, and I never know quite what to read, and I just want to emphasize or reinforce that point. I don't want to fish through Zulip chats. I really don't. It's not something that I enjoy doing. I don't know what to search for, and I'm totally on board with the idea that actually having this repository of well-structured and well-thought-out documentation where you can kind of read it in your own time, this RFC repository is hugely valuable, and I'm just all for it.
All right, Steve, counterpoint. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. No, I think another example of how to solve this kind of problem actually is LWN. You can have a reporter, right? I'm not down at City Hall, listening to every single meeting that happens down there, but I do read the news and I find out when there's a new law that's been passed in my city, right? And so you could also have dedicated, reporters, sort of, kind of, and that's, I think, because it's not like the Linux kernel mailing list is also hyper accessible to many people either, even though it's a little more public than maybe a chat thread would be. But there's other ways, essentially curation, to solve these kinds of problems. And so we'll see what happens in the future to kind of change that side of things.
So totally agreed on LWN. LWN is more or less Jonathan Corbett. Maybe we should just convince Jonathan Corbett, you're kind of, hey, this whole Linux thing is kind of played out. Why don't you come over to Rust and because I agree with you.
Well,
his reportage is so good.
He is currently hiring someone, and someone with a Rust beat is on the job application thing. Wow. Because of Rust being in the kernel. He's this is probably going to be relevant to us in the future. So it might also just literally be LWN. But we'll see how that goes. I pay for LWN even though I haven't used Linux in years because it's just so good, and you're totally right. It's basically just him as far as I know, or a very small team, but it's super, super important.
It is really important, and it's actually, you're right, because it's a very good example. It's very good reportage in that he's excellent at saying, this person says this thing, and then this other person had a different point of view. He doesn't seem to inject his own point of view too much in there, which is pretty remarkable because he's often wading into things that are highly contentious.
The Linux kernel development community is not known for people not expressing their opinions on things, and so it is a rarity in that crowd. Yes, so totally. But
good reportage would be good because Tim, I obviously agree with you. Steve might not agree with you about the importance of the RFCs. But it is really, really important. And I found as actually. When I first came to Rust in 2018, I was going into those RFCs a lot to understand the origin of stuff. And I think also in 2018, I would be interested to know if this is still true today, when 4+ years later. But it's certainly in 2018, I felt like you were often ending up in the RFCs to understand why things were the way they were or weren't the way that you would expect them to be. But I don't know, Steve. Do you have a sense of how true that is today?
I mean, I definitely think that that's a thing that happens over time, because as more of stable Rust is a thing, like you need less of that context, because like how you do it is the way it's always been done in stable or whatever, right? Like as a feature is about to land, you really care about the RFC, but 10 years after a feature lands, you're probably not going to go look at the RFC because it's just like a normal thing you use. And so I would expect that like as the number of things lands and becomes stable, and as time goes on, that it will be in generally less and less valuable to people. In terms of what I mean, not to people, I mean like a working Rust programmer will need to know even less than they used to.
All right, so Steve, I'm also curious about your perspective on this, because I mean, we're obviously always victims of our own experience. And this is where I feel like kind of crotchety about my own Rust experience. I kind of feel like trying to learn Rust pre non-lexical lifetimes versus post non-lexical lifetimes. Non-lexical lifetimes feels to me like a real watershed feature that completely changed the approachability of the language. But it's hard for me. I mean, but it also happened kind of as I was just getting comfortable with the language. So is that a fair read, or is that not accurate, do you think?
So this is going to sound negative, but I promise it's not actually. I agree with you only because that's like what literally everybody else says. I honestly did not need non-lexical lifetimes very often, and it's a thing that's puzzled me for a very long time, is like, what is the way that I wrote code different than everybody else where they were running into it constantly? And I was like, basically not really. So I do think it's important. I do think it's a really big change. I think it mattered to a lot of people, but I didn't have that experience personally very much.
You sound like you're a sociopath at a funeral. Like I
know,
understand why everyone else is crying, but it's like I understand that you are feeling sadness, but this is not an emotion that maybe it's sort of like Data from Star Trek.
Yeah, I get it. This is like, well, this is just like, there's a couple things like that have been in Rust where it's like, okay, this definitely is really important to people, but like just not to me, and like that's fine, that's great. As you said, just because one person needs or doesn't need a feature doesn't mean it should be added or removed, right? We're talking about the broader population. I think what's interesting about non-lexical lifetimes is, to me, and I think it's actually more significant than Rust, actually. I think that non-lexical lifetimes is actually a significant step forward in understanding how programmers think about their craft. I'm actually willing to galaxy brain it that far. And the reason is this. The lifetimes were originally implemented lexically, partially I think because it's like easier, but partially because it was believed that programmers truly like understand the concept of scope. That's like a very core thing to what we do, and like that the idea of scope in programmers' minds would be lexical scope. And so it was like considered really, really important that like people be able to grok lifetimes, and therefore we wanted to match the way that we thought programmers like mental models kind of like worked. And so that was like, it's very simple. Like you introduce a variable here, and then at the end of the curly brace, it's out. And so like, what could be harder than that? Whereas like, if you're trying to explain non-lexical lifetimes in like a more formal kind of way, it's like, well, there's a control flow graph, and like the exit point of the control flow graph is the way this works. But like what we actually, I think, have empirically shown is that programmers don't think about scope in a lexical sense. And so the thing that's like technically non-lexical lifetimes are far more complicated than lexical lifetimes. But for people, it's actually an easier way to think about it because it matches their mental model of scope more appropriately, which is the last time I stop using this, it should just be done with or whatever. And so I think that that's like an insight into programmer psychology that's like relatively rare that you get those kinds of developments. But yeah, I think it like is very interesting for that reason alone.
Yeah, okay, that is interesting. I mean, it felt honestly and I think it's interesting that you did not get inflicted by this as much. And it may have been that I was coming from C and was making a lot of the mistakes that I think C programmers make, where you're just used to having like, oh, I need to have like a back pointer here. It's like, Rust's like, no, please don't. And so it may have been that. It was really, really frustrating when you had Rust is very upset with you. And because you can't do this because this variable is still it is still being owned, and you're like, no, but look, computer, can't you see the same program that I'm seeing? Like, I'm obviously done with this thing. And it felt less like I was having to generate spurious scopes that shouldn't be required in order to force lexical lifetimes.
Totally.
But maybe that's interesting. That maybe.
I mean, I also write a very like nuts and bolts, nothing fancy style of Rust in many circumstances, largely because, a lot of my history is not only writing my own programs, but when I'm trying to teach beginners, I've iterated on the basic syntax like a zillion times. And so I probably just also, you were like immediately getting into stuff that's like relatively, not complicated in the sense of like the most complicated thing ever, but like I'm often teaching beginners and therefore I'm not using fancy stuff, or like my examples are a little more contrived. And so I probably just ran up into it a lot less because you were like getting useful active work done in like relatively complex scenarios right away. So I think that probably has something to do with it too.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that like that. I'm trying to think of other features that were. Are there other Rust features that were like that were where the state of Rust kind of gave us insight into programmer psychology, or the way people wanted to think about the problem. Versus,
sorry.
Go ahead.
So just to kind of pick up Steve's Galaxy Brain kind of thought, the one thing that I really liked about non-lexical lifetimes was that the community decided that actually programmers were the important thing here, and actually we can bend the language to adjust to how people's mental model actually is, which demonstrates, I think, a lot of humility, because there's an engineering challenge to kind of refactor something so core like lifetimes to Rust. I guess another aspect of that would be kind of a real emphasis on high quality error messages. Would be sort of similar. Like if you compare the error messages from say 2018 to now, I think most people bumping into things are going to have a better time today than they did a few years ago.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
I agree with that. Yeah.
And that's
Adam,
actually a similar, I was actually, that butts right into what I was going to say is another example of a feature. It's like this sort of kind of is the debate over the syntax for async await was largely talked about and in ways of like, how are people going to understand this? And one of the things that sort of helped get it over the line was like, no, we're going to parse the JavaScript syntax for async await and recommend our new weird syntax for async await. And that will help solve that problem for when people's mental model of how it should be is like the other one from a different language. And so you solve that problem via a good error message and caring about error messages because you're trying to focus on the programmer and the way they think about stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a great example, Steve, because I think that the amount of work that I'm sure went into turning that into a coherent error message was non-trivial. And then beyond like some of the technical implementation, the thing that, I mean, we haven't really talked much about the Rust community, but that's the other thing I love about Rust so much. And so I wrote a blog post about my first use of Rust, like 6 years ago or something. And I didn't even look back until, when Steve started. Steve, you joined Oxide about 2 years ago now?
A little over 2, yeah.
Jeez, it's nuts.
No, right?
So, and I think like shortly after Steve started, for whatever reason, I went back to this Hacker News thread, and Steve's like comment was number one, being like, "Hey, I'm like sorry this was tricky. Like, what would have been more helpful?" And of course, I didn't see it until it was much too late to be useful in that regard. But like, I thought that was an amazing example of just like how much Steve in particular, but the Rust community cared about making this thing like good and useful and intuitive and overcoming obstacles to understanding.
Yeah, and this was in 2015, Adam, that you did your first, and actually, Steve, it was funny because Adam was the first person that I knew who really went into Rust, who was like, I would view as like, one of my peers and someone who's going to have a pragmatic approach. And I remember reading that blog entry, be like, man, thank God Adam did this. So now I'd never have to touch this language ever in my life, because this is so clearly a horrific experience. And then Adam's blog entry is like, and in conclusion, I look forward to using Rust again. I'm like, Adam, read your own blog entry. It's like, you're in a bad relationship with this thing.
I know, it's such a weird experience, but because at the time, I was writing. At the time, I was asking a screening question. I've as people who I've worked with or have interviewed with me know, I basically have like 2 questions I've been asking for like the last 15 years. And one of them is a screening question that we would ask at a couple of different companies. That's like, write a anagrammer and do in whatever language you wanted. And we had some interns who like like, well, I'm going to write it in Rust. I was like, okay, don't show me, but I'm going to go try this. And I went and tried it, and it was kind of brutal. And it was brutal, and I think in the ways that like dummies go to learn Rust, which is just to be like, okay, I know how to program. Like, don't tell me, like, I don't need to wait for the translation. I'll just like write this code. Like, what's the syntax? Like, it's probably like something else I know. And
Adam, can I just get something out of my head right now that is just driving me crazy? Earlier today, you replied to a tweet of someone who's like, when do you see something that automatically you think of The Simpsons? And
yes.
That is now in my brain, and is like, so like literally as you're speaking this, like the image that comes to mind is Silent Bob stepping on rakes.
No, that's exactly what it was. That was exactly what it was. But I think as I had time to sort of think about what I had done, and sort of like done the thing that I should have done when I started writing the program, which was to appreciate the differences of the language, I realized the unique concepts of ownership and of lifetimes and these kinds of things that I had never seen in a language. And if I had paused before writing to try to understand, like if you read Steve's book, like he takes pains to like explain to you, if you just skim past those things, that's what caught my eye, that it was like, this was a new thing. This wasn't like a language I had used before.
Yeah, and I think that actually, I love you got a couple of great lines in there where you describe moving from anger into bargaining.
I mean, I don't know if people still. I mean, I know that Rust has gotten so much better.
It's gotten so much better, but oh god,
Brian, have you written any async Rust?
Yes and yes.
Okay.
Yes, and I know exactly where you're going.
Yes.
Like you're screaming down the street.
So there is definitely like stages of grief, but there's also like, do you ever have the compiler is like, hey, this will all work if you use the static lifetime.
Totally.
You're like, oh
totally.
Fuck. Like, what have I done that? Like, this will only work if you can promise me that nothing will change for eternity. It's like, okay, well, I can't promise that. Okay, fine. Like, I've messed up more fundamentally.
Just commit. Why can't you just commit?
Why can't I just marry all my data structures if I love them so much? Yeah.
Adam, what I thought you were going to say is like when the compiler's like, actually, this will work, but you need to change that to be mutable. You're like, okay. And you change that to mutable. The compiler's like, what the hell are you doing, you dumbass? Yeah. Now nothing works. And you're just like, okay. It's like, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
You do have still have these moments. And I remember even at the time, like the Rust compiler being like, try this. And it's like, who told you to do that? Yeah. Like, what? Why did you think that was going to work? Stupid. It's like, why are you hitting yourself?
Right. And it's actually, it's like so earnest and helpful about the way it's telling you that you like lost your mind, that you're just like, in some ways it's even like, in some ways it'd actually be like a little bit easier if it were just like, look, you're being a dumbass. Like you just do not, look, I'm sorry. This is the fourth time you tried to do this. I don't think you understand how this program works at all. Like, I'm just going to I'm letting you know.
But there's nothing like async to help me like expose my ignorance, and also to like vomit out some like error message that I need to like full screen my terminal in order to even like have a hope of understanding what's going on.
What was Dave's error message early? Do you remember the one that he had that was like 1,300 lines long? He had an error message that was just like, it is absolutely monstrous, the kinds of things. And that has all gotten better, but it is still, I think it highlights you do. And actually, I really appreciated the Programming Rust book and Steve, I know you're emphatic about this too in the Rust programming language, but just like the need for early programmers to change your mental model. Do not, if you walk into Rust with your existing mental model, it's going to hurt. Like, and if you just try to get a doubly linked list working, it's not going to end well, and you're going to be in the wrong parts of the language, basically.
In the super, good.
No, you go ahead.
In the super old days, it was really common for C or C++ people to join IRC and be like, hey, I'm trying to write this program that's like clearly fine, but the compiler won't let it work. What do I have to do to get the compiler to shut up? And you have to be like, well, what would happen if that got moved to another thread? And they'd be like, oh, like, yeah, that's what the compiler is telling you, is that you were actually like about to do something that does not actually work. Just because you thought it worked doesn't mean it actually works. And there was a really big predictive power, like basically the way it's like a very sort of like stoicism kind of thing, right? Like you can either try to change the world, or you can change the way that you think about what's coming in. And so like we'd see people be successful if their reaction to that was, oh, neat, huh? Versus like, well, I know better. There's no thread there. There's never going to be any thread there. How would I get the compiler to shut up? And it's like, okay, like you're not going to have a good time actually.
Totally. When Rusty is like asking you questions about your program, it's not bad questions, right? These are the questions that nobody was asking me about my programs before, and it sort of either worked by accident or it didn't.
Yeah. And the trick is to make sure it's right often enough that you trust it. Because if it's not right often enough, then, like the thing with the lifetimes that Brian was talking about earlier, then you become frustrated because you do know better than the compiler. And like the more that you can get, the better the compiler is at actually being correct in those situations, the more you're able to trust it. And therefore, the more you're able to like offload your mental capacity to it. But if it doesn't work, then like, then it's a problem.
Look, that learning curve can be near vertical though. And it can be a serious gut punch to the ego to have to absorb what the Rust compiler is telling you. And I've seen this multiple places now. In my last project at Google, when I convinced, folks early on to switch from C++ to Rust, we found ourselves trying to write C in Rust and then being very frustrated for 2 or 3 or however many weeks until we kind of were like, okay, we need to let go of this. And it's just like, I can no longer wrap my identity around being a C programmer, and like, that's gotta be okay. And once we kind of did that, then we were all right. But yeah, we had the issue where people were like, this code is perfectly defined. How dare the compiler argue with me? And the flip side of that is that I've seen extremely experienced Unix people turn around and say, I don't understand why this language exists. It doesn't do anything that C doesn't do, and it forces you to sprinkle unsafe and mud all over the place. And it's like, well, you're thinking about it wrong. It actually is very frustrating.
Well, there's actually a pretty good hacker news thread that I think that Adam, you'd seen over the weekend, right? On learning Rust. I think and Steve, it's been interesting for you to kind of watch like the broader programming community change its disposition really towards Rust, because it feels like now there is a much more. I think people are much more embracing of the mental model shift than they were 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago. Is that a fair read?
I think that's true. I think it also like people, you kind of go through like crossing the chasm is always like at the forefront of my mind. That whole thing is like really essential to the way I view a lot of things. And so I think that it's not even so much that people are more amenable. It's just that like now that the value has been demonstrated, and now that like you can get a job, and now that there's like projects that you care about that you want to contribute to where Rust exists, more people are willing to put in the effort to learn something new because they know what they're going to get in return. Like in the old days, you basically were getting like hope. Maybe someday I'll be able to get a job in this language, and therefore I'm going to learn it because I like it for other abstract reasons. I have some sort of other motivation. And I think now we're getting to the point where there's a much more like meat and potatoes reasons to like learn the language that's not, I'm a programming language theory nerd and this affine type system is cool or whatever. And so I think that's also part of it too, is like not even necessarily sentiment changing. It's just that like it is more clear that the cost benefit is maybe worth it, and therefore people are more willing to even entertain it in the first place.
And could you elaborate on what you mean by crossing the chasm?
There's a business book called Crossing the Chasm, and it's about how disruptive technologies succeed in the market or whatever, something vaguely along those lines. And there's this diagram that's basically like a bell curve, except for at the first quartile, there's like a gap. And so it's basically like there's sort of like 6 or 7 or 8 cohorts of users, and each of those cohorts uses a technology for different reasons, and they start using a technology at a different place in its life. So the leftmost are like the extreme innovators or something. I don't remember. This is a business book, so it's full of silly jargon. But like those are the people that like use a thing just for the sake of using it because they enjoy using it, and they'll like always try new things because the fact that it's new is good enough justification on its own. And the far other side is like the late majority, or the laggards, I think is the term they actually use. And those are folks who like that Java thing is probably used enough that I'll start using it now. Like like a COBOL programmer that's still writing COBOL today that's like getting around to trying those newfangled things that have been successful for 10 or 20 years because they just, are much more conservative with their technology choices. And the trick is that a lot of things die before they can like cross the chasm. They can jump over that gap between the like people who are interested in a thing early because they see the potential, and the people who like just want to get their job done for the day and don't really care. And it's like, how do you get your thing, or the trick is to get your thing from that early audience to that like bigger, more normal audience. And once you've done that, you're successful and you're going to exist forever. But like lots of technologies sort of die trying to get to that kind of like, larger group of people. It's much more, if you look at the diagram, it's like very visual, so it's like kind of easier to see how this works out. But I hope that verbal description is good enough.
That's a great description. Of course, natural follow-up question: when did Rust cross the chasm?
Yeah, well, see, that's like kind of an interesting thing because you don't. One of the tricks is like you don't really necessarily know until like a lot later, and so I think a lot of people would like cite like Rust like.
I've got my idea of the answer to this question, so I'm very curious for your answer.
My answer to this question is actually the MVP of async await dropping.
Okay.
And that is because while everybody, I shouldn't say everybody, while there are a lot of criticisms of async and like there's still a lot of work to do there and like all this other stuff, if you look at the actual numbers of people reporting on the survey, like what they use Rust for and what they use Rust for at work, it is network services. And it doesn't matter how many people on Hacker News say that you shouldn't write network services in an unmanaged language because it's the wrong tool for the job. A lot of people actually do think it's the right tool for the job. And async await landing was a significant step forward in getting people to be able to write those things. And it honestly is still one of the biggest user groups of Rust just purely by the numbers. And I don't think it feels that way or it's reflected in the social side of things as much. But that's like the actual situation is that that's what Rust is being used for in many, many, many cases. So I think that was the real point at which it became more useful to a lot of those folks, is because everything touches the network now, basically. He says when his day job is writing firmware for a device that's not connected to the network.
Well, for what it's worth, that was actually the point for me as well. And I'm trying to not turn this into an advertisement for what we do, but we use Tokyo and Axum and Tokyo Console and Postgres data persistence, and we could not have built what we were building without Rust and without the compile times, without the lifetimes, without the compile time reliability. It actually was a thing where a lot of us were formerly Go programmers and Rubyists, and we kind of said we could not have built this without this. And like, I am trying to like put a positive spin because I do agree with you, Steve. There's definitely like some work to do and the ergonomics aren't that great. Like, for instance, right now, we bumped everything out to factory, which is kind of like Sidekick for those of you who've used it. And we're sort of spawning off jobs when the threads get too big. Otherwise, in debug mode, some of our async threads will kind of explode. And like we've seen it in Tokyo Console. We like, sort of watch them kind of like balloon a little. But at the same time, it's those kind of moments where like, well, maybe that should have been a Go routine. But all the other benefits and everything else that come along with it has certainly been like we could not have done XYZ thing without that. So the MVP was definitely there because, a lot of us were kind of like silently in the back waiting. We're like, okay, we see the embedded use cases, we see the C and C++ replacement scenarios, but we're kind of sort of like, when can I use this like my everyday like backend or full stack job? And I would say that at least from my channels was certainly where I saw heightened chatter.
It's like, Steve, are you playing a 1940s radio sound effects reel?
No, sorry.
It sounds like I'm like waiting for the door to open and close, the footsteps.
I make tea in mason jars and put it in my fridge. And so I'd set that up right before this happened, and so I was just putting the lids on and putting them in my refrigerator, and I didn't realize you could hear that. So my bad. But
no. It was like crystal clear sound effects. It was actually so sorry,
amazing.
Nick. I didn't
No, you're fine. I mean, I make Chemexes in the morning, and everyone's always like, "Why is Nick's video off?" And then I'll have to like put in chat like, I'm like making a pour over and it's going to taste terrible, but I'm going to like it anyway. So
Yeah,
I've
totally.
totally been there. Yep.
So that's interesting. But Nick, you've got the same feeling as Steve and Adam. I think I wonder if you have that same thought, because I mean, coming into Oxide, you were definitely like, look, I can see Rust for these kind of low down the stack. That makes tons of sense. Higher in the stack, I think it might make less sense. But that's something that you've since kind of changed your thinking on.
No, totally. So when I joined, I wrote my first Rust in 2015. I had the dates wrong, but then I didn't really do anything with it again. Like when I started my last company in whatever it was, like 2016. I know it's
1962.
Yeah, exactly. It's moving quicker than I thought. The choices were sort of like Go and Java, and then I'll say without embarrassment, we chose Java. But those felt like the right answers for the kinds of problems that we were solving. And
is now when we can talk about your love affair with Antler?
Oh, I do love Antler. Antler is wonderful. I'm happy that we could have a whole week long of shows on Antler. I'd be happy to do that. No, I think Antler is really cool.
Antler is really neat. It seems really cool.
So, but I liked Rust. I liked Rust the first time I tried it, and I was fired up coming into Oxide and was reading books on it and stuff like that. But I did come in, and week one I was like, well, why are we for say the web layer or whatever? Maybe it makes sense to use something like Java, or maybe it makes sense to use another language. But I would say that it didn't take that long to feel like the perceived obstacles associated with Rust were far outweighed by all of the obvious benefits, and that just you can trick yourself into saying like, well, if I'm using these Tinker toys with Java, and I can't get myself into these kinds of problems, but you clearly can. And you're bringing on a whole host of other problems with a garbage collected language. So, I think that I am no longer claimed to be unbiased. I'm hugely biased in favor of Rust. Like I and maybe this is as good time as any, but I didn't. People talked about loving programming languages. Like I worked with someone who loved Java. And I didn't think I was capable of loving a language. Like I didn't think that was a thing that I had in me. And now I am like
his heart grew 3 sizes larger that day.
That's right. But I just thought it was no, you just pick the right tool for the right job, and love has I don't know, sometimes Python's the right answer, I guess, or Java, or even Bash. Although I hope our colleague Dave Pacheco doesn't hear me say this, because he has told me that Bash is never the right answer for anything, unless you're trying to signal to people that you don't take a problem seriously.
That is true. Yes.
Okay, well, fair enough. But I still use Bash because sometimes
I used Bash this morning.
There we go.
I got a gnarly Bash
right now. I gotta say, a lot of things are looking like a Rust-shaped nail for me now. I think that I'd use it in a lot of different contexts that a couple of years ago or 2.5 years ago didn't necessarily seem appropriate. But in terms of the crossing the chasm, I think this is not going to be as pinned down in terms of a timeline. And Brian, I'd be curious your answer, but I felt like in that sort of early 2020 timeframe, I went from thinking, a couple people are using this, or it's being used here and there for sort of the inner loop of whatever, to looking up and seeing that anyone who was doing serious systems programming was kicking the tires on Rust or using it in a very serious fashion. And that dam sort of broke, it feels like right around that time. Now, I know that I'm biased and I'm sort of now getting into Rust, but it feels more and more like around that time frame was when the folks doing these kinds of systems problems really kind of jumped in.
Well, and that would dovetail with Steve's async await timing, honestly. So that would be, that's interesting. And so
it doesn't have to be a feature, right? Because we're talking about basically timelines of different populations of groups, and so I'm just saying that I think that's around when it was, but I definitely think 2018 was a bike shed year or a watershed year, some sort of shed. Let's talk about is it bike shedding when you talk about which kind of shed it is? Is that the meta
That's
bike
right.
shed?
That's right.
But that was definitely our bike shed moment. No.
Yeah, I feel around 2018,
Yeah.
for whatever reason, was when stuff really cemented itself and started taking off even more than it was previously.
I got on the internet moments before the Eternal September of 1993. I got on the internet in the fall of 1992. So the fact that I got into Rust in 2018, right before crossing the chasm, I think that's I'll take that.
Yeah. I also, the last thing
Yeah.
I want to say about Crossing the Chasm, I think it's really important that programmers understand where they fall on that line, and that can change for different things too. Because I was a super early adopter of Rust, but I don't think I've ever written a Docker file, for example. So I'm an extreme laggard on Docker, but I'm super early in Rust, and I felt much better about various technologies when I understood how I felt about how early of an adopter I wanted to be, and recognizing that other people are in a different stage in that area. And a lot of arguments happen between people who have an early adopter mindset versus a majority mindset. And then they talk past each other because they don't realize they're both getting out of or not getting out of the situation what they wanted, just because they're coming from a different place in the first place. So I think it's also helped me deal with a lot of arguing online about stuff by knowing that thinking about that mental framework and figuring out where I fit into it for whatever technology we're talking about.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I also think that you're making an important point too, that where you are in that curve may be more of a function of the problem you're solving and less of a function of you as a technologist. That as a technologist, you may be an early adopter in one regard and actually a late adopter in another regard, and that doesn't make you a dullard or a laggard or what have you. But and being kind of self-aware of that is important. Lukeman, I wanted to get you in here because you've been in the Rust community for a really long time, and did you have a sense of when the chasm was crossed? To the degree that I think we have crossed the chasm, I would assume.
Sure. I mean, I feel like a lot of my time has been spent lurking. Early on, I did do a lot more when I interned there and other stuff. But then after that, it kind of went away. Doing work stuff, life stuff, but kind of just keeping an eye on it in the background, just playing around with it myself. But I do think around 2018, right when async, the MVP was starting to land, was I think this could actually be a thing that I could convince someone at work that I could use. I actually remember writing right before that release was cut, some little project with async, Tokyo, and all that stuff, and then showing my manager at the time is look at this. It was I did this in a week, and it does so much better than what we already have, kind of thing.
Okay, that's interesting, Luke. So that is an interesting kind of acid test when you can go to a new technology and kind of catch up to where the exit technology is in a remarkably quick period of time. I do think that's a kind of a hallmark to when something is becoming really real.
Yeah.
And so for me, because I actually the thing that really drew my attention to Rust after, it was so Adam's terrific experience, never touching that. But then when honestly, Steve, and I don't know if it would have been maybe 2016, 2017, when was the green threads removed?
2014.
2014, so that's before Adam. Interesting.
It was before 1.0, yeah.
Because that, to me, I thought that's a super interesting decision. Because it felt very pragmatic and very much aligned with my own experience and wisdom. But it felt, and I'm sure that was controversial at the time. Was that controversial at the time?
Yes and no. It definitely.
I think it depended on who you were talking to. Some people were all for it.
It was also largely spearheaded by someone who was often the source of controversy, and so I think also some people were colored by non-technical factors when talking about that at the time, if I remember correctly. Sorry, Lukeman, you were saying something and I said something.
Oh no, yeah, I just remember thinking, depending on who you ask, maybe some of the more people familiar with Node kind of stuff were yeah, no, segmented stacks, green threads, that's great, versus people who wanted to, run it on the PS3 or what have you, were just we want libnative, basically. And then the difficulty is well, how do you deal with segmented stacks when you have inline assembly and other parts of the language that make it really difficult?
Yeah, every language that's used segmented stacks has eventually removed them at some point. Is my understanding, basically.
Yes.
Let alone, obviously a lot of people still do green thread stuff, but I think segmented stacks is definitely an idea whose time has gone, for sure.
it's just it's the details. And the reason that it kind of turned my head, although I guess I found out about I've got the chronology wrong here, but the reason that it turned my head is because it does reflect people really trying to use a system. And I think that things will kind of happily use green threads when they are actually not really getting into the mechanics of getting something that is going to run for a long period of time and run robustly. But when you are like, there's so many edge conditions, it feels like it's such a good idea. And it's such a long tail of disasters that are really, really hard to mitigate. That to me was like, okay, wow, this is actually getting real and is going to be used for real systems. I came into Rust for whatever it's worth. I've been meaning to look into it for maybe 6 months, 12 months by the time I got into it. Although one of my coworkers, Adam, Leventhal's me gloriously by maintaining that I was deriding Rust to him in 2013 or 2014. Matt Smiley, wherever you are, exactly. So he had cackled uproariously when I fell in love with Rust because he felt that it was a grand comeuppance, and maybe it was. But I felt like I was looking into Rust out of desperation, honestly, because I felt like I just couldn't find a home for myself, and I'm like, if it's not going to be. If this is like my last best hope, you're talking about like coming to Rust out of hope, Steve.
Yeah.
And actually, I think since then the environment has actually improved. I think that there are other languages. And I actually think this is in part due to the success of Rust. Is that Rust has shown that there's a space there, and other languages like Zig are starting to be in that space. And I think that that's actually really healthy. I think that that's a good thing. I'm not sure your take on that, but I liked having more languages experiment with different ideas. I think is good.
Very good.
One thing I also wanted to get to, in addition to kind of pulling people on Crossing the Chasm, I wanted to just because I know I'm going to learn something. I wanted to hear people's like small features that have been added over the last couple of years that are really meaningful to their quality of life. And I've got a handful of these, but I imagine other people have got ones that I have not heard of or I have missed. I mean, we talked about inline ASM. Do you use const generics, Adam? Is that something that?
Yes, I do. In a way that like is totally different than you guys. Like I remember in Hubris, you guys being very fired up for that, and I got fired up for it in like a really dumb way for a like an open API SDK generator that I've built, and this is such a weird use of Rust, or like such a, I don't know. When people think about Rust, it's not for like calling like dumbass REST APIs or whatever, but like JSON schema. Okay, I'm losing everyone like by the second. Lets you say. Define an integer that is like a multiple of 7 or fucking whatever. So I used a const generic to define that.
Oh, nice! I didn't realize that. I didn't realize that story was going to end so quickly.
Yeah,
I thought
you're like, oh, geez, this sob story is going to go on and on. No, it's just like it lets you define a type that's like, here's a number that has some weird properties, like it needs to be between 12 and 1,000 and a multiple of 7. And const generics are a way that like I don't have to kind of do a bespoke type for each one, or it can be structural in the type rather than just like an input parameter or something like that.
Oh, that's very cool, and that's in Progenitor.
That's right.
Oh, that's really neat. Oh, cool. Okay, yeah. So all right. Well, that answers that question. You definitely do. What are some other little ones that you? Are there other?
I have another one that like only I give a shit about, which was like I write I'm not sure how to write Rust is the first way I'm going to say this, which is I think different people write Rust differently. Like I've looked in, and it's Oxide is such a great case. Most of our repos are open, but you can find a bunch of Rust code that looks like C code. And certainly like if you're in my neck of the woods, not that I'd recommend it, you can have Rust code that sort of feels more like, I guess, Go or Java or something like that. And you can have lots of like, you can have folks who want to use a for loop for everything, and you can have folks who want to use a like for each on an iterator for everything.
Is this an intervention?
Which one are you?
You know which one okay, I've been trying to get better. I've been trying to be more like, I'm trying to get more mappy foldy, but I
No. What I'm saying is I'm way too mappy-foldy to the point where
this is an intervention. This is an intervention. Look, I'll change. I can get better. I will use more. I will stop using for loops. So
So like I'm to the point where seriously, if I have to name a variable, I think I've fucked up. Or if I have to have something be mutable, I feel embarrassed.
Have you used into iterator on option?
Yes. So that's exactly what I'm. So that's what I'm going. So not only have I used into iterator on option, Steve, but I am using the bool has a then.
Then, yeah.
Yes.
So I've been using a bunch of bool then so that I can launch myself from the pedestrian world of like integral types into the lofty world of things I can try with a capital T or iterate over or reduce. I'm saying this is a cry for help, not an intervention, Brian.
No, I feel like because I'm just not. I feel that I myself I'm trying to be more mappy foldy. And Clippy is trying to help me for whatever it's worth. Clippy's like, you moron, this should not be affordable. Like,
do you ever have Clippy recommend something and you're like, okay, fine, Clippy, let's do it your way. And then the compiler's like, this is terrible. Like this is garbage. Come on.
Mom and dad are fighting.
Exactly. Don't tell me that Clippy told you to do this. I mean, if Clippy told you to jump off a bridge, would you do it? Of course not.
Yes, I would.
Actually, I probably would. Actually, I would go to Steve and I would say, hey, Clippy's starting to jump off a bridge. That doesn't sound right. Could someone please? No, you really should be jumping off a bridge. Okay, fine. Jump off a bridge.
I think it actually touches on something interesting that has been sort of a detraction I've had for Rust. I just want to start off the bat. I'm a huge fan of Rust. I wish it nothing but success. But I think when Adam said that there's a lot of different ways to write Rust, I think that's totally true in terms of what you end up with. But as a practice, I think one of the reasons that it's hard for Rust, or was hard for Rust to jump over that chasm, is because it kind of shifts the line about what a programming language is. Because I don't know anybody who understands how to write Rust without Rust Analyzer and Clippy. There's a sort of Esperantoism of Rust, where it's not really the language that anybody writes sort of unassisted, or it's not their sort of like first language. It's not the thing that they really think in. They have sort of a conversation with their tools in order to construct the program. I don't think that's necessarily negative, but it's very interesting.
It's a great point. And I think that one that sort of leans on modern, like what we can do in a way that then becomes structural, but also important. I'll go one further, which is, when I'm looking at code reviews in GitHub, I sometimes find the Rust unintelligible because it's like, let variable name equals whatever, and I am desperate for Rust Analyzer to tell me the types of everything. Like I'll sit there and assign things to types just so that Rust Analyzer can help me figure out what's coming out the other end. But you're right that these types have become extremely. I mean, these tools have become extremely load bearing for how everyone writes Rust.
Better IDE support was like one of the number one things on the survey every year for a very long time. For exactly that reason.
I like syntax highlighting, which I also don't use. I have learned not to bring this up in mixed company that I don't use Rust Analyzer. I not pejoratively. I just don't end up. It's part of the reason that I'm not mappy foldy always, because it is easier. Although again, I'm trying to get better about that and trying to really rewire my brain around it. And it does I think yield better code. But Drew, I think to your point, I actually do think Rust is becoming the way I think about a problem. Rust has become the way I think about a problem, I should say. It is my first language at this point. And actually, I went back to write. At least I hope it's my first language, because when I went back to write C recently, it was otherworldly. It was a very strange experience.
Okay, how do I pattern match again? What's the syntax for that?
I just feel like with C, I feel like I'm going cave diving, where I'm just okay, I've got to triple check all the equipment. I've got this is 100% on me, and a lot of people die down here. So I need to be, where I'm not in the Rust swimming pool here, where nothing is going to help me out. I need to be very. The compiler is not going to help me out. I've become very accustomed to the compiler helping me out.
Does anybody feel that learning Rust has made them a better C programmer?
For sure. No question, has made me a better, because, and that is, Dan, why I've got such trepidation. And I mean, I said this early on with Rust, that one of the things that we don't talk about enough with Rust is the integer safety. And the one of the most serious vulnerabilities in dtrace was an integer safety issue that lint did not catch, the compiler did not. No one like helped me. I felt like abandoned by everybody and I had done something that is extremely common in C, where you're saying if bounds plus size is less than my limit, then it's good to go. And it's like, nope, not necessarily. And no one is actually going to actually check on that. And if you have integer unsafety, so I do feel it's made me a better C programmer, although also a more cautious one as a result. Dan, do you feel it's made you a better C programmer?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. And so I went through the exercise a few years ago, rewriting MIT's XV6 operating system in Rust. And, you know, having, and that was really, it was a very interesting exercise because having the C code next to the Rust code was fascinating because I saw bugs in the C code that I would have never seen had I not actively been writing in Rust and thinking about those things.
So, Dan, do you have some little features that have been added over the years that you particularly like?
Well, so it's weird. I've spent the bulk of my time writing Rust code, writing bare metal code for large-scale systems. So I never, it's weird. Async was mentioned earlier, and it just mystifies me because it's totally foreign to my experience. When I got to Oxide, I found myself writing a very different type of Rust than I had been writing. But definitely ASM, oh my goodness. The new ASM, well, it's not new anymore. It's like 4 or 5 years old now. But the sort of stabilized ASM syntax changed my life. All those weird little glyphs that you had to put in with the GCC style LLVM inline ASM stuff. And it's like, okay, you put an M here, and I think that means a memory operand. But nobody really knows because this is all just kind of strange. And put a star there, and maybe it'll do something different, and maybe it'll do what you want. Like when the new ASM syntax came in, I was ecstatic. That just blew my mind.
Yeah, I saw a tweet recently that somebody said, like, if you show me some assembly written in gas syntax, I'm going to assume that you're a serial killer in your spare time.
It's the only thing that makes sense. Another one that happened, I guess, not too recently, maybe earlier in the year, but capture identifiers and format strings. Do you use this, Adam?
This is where you can do like open curly, name of variable, close curly. Yeah, a colleague of ours, John Gallagher, was using that. And I was like, cool, I didn't know you could do that. So I didn't even know that this was relatively recent. I've started using it. It's really cool.
It's really cool. And I like your const generics where I've got some residual shame over why I like captured identifiers so much in format strings. Because I am strung out addicted to build RS, and I'm a hardened build. I mean, this is actually where you do, Drew, you didn't make an earlier point that it's like Rust blurs some of the boundaries. One of the boundaries that it blurs in a great way is the boundary between the build system and the artifact. And build RS lives in this kind of interstitial layer. And the ability to generate code programmatically has just been huge for programming at the hardware software layer. And that's actually ends up being like a lot of format strings. And that ends up being a lot of variables in format strings. So it's kind of a filthy use case, but it's been liberating.
I like this feature for an obscure reason, which is it's very similar to the way that you do it in Ruby, which you have a pound first and then the curlies to put a variable, to interpolate a variable there. But back when I used to teach Ruby, I used to explain to people to help them remember the syntax that the curlies are like little crab pinchers that hold the variable in place in that part of the string. And so for that then to end up in Rust and the whole crabs thing like years later is like very satisfying to me.
That's awesome.
A homecoming. Steve, what are some of your or actually, listen, I can see you unmuting there. Wait, do you have a favorite one you want to tell?
Yeah, I have a small one that was recent. Arc new cyclic.
Ooh. Okay, tell me about that one.
It's just like lets you create an arc, and at creation time, you give it this closure where you get the weak reference to it, so you can store it or whatever. So you can create these like self-referential things much more easily without having to resort to a bunch of unsafe like we were doing in Propolis for a while.
So what are you using this for?
Sometimes you just want to hold a weak reference to something that is
All right.
already held by the strong reference.
All right. Why all the questions? I get it.
Yeah. Like, look, Mom, he'll be home when he's home. Okay, so just like just get off it. Yeah, friends.
Sometimes you just need to do it.
Right. That's really cool. Yeah, I had not. That's a good example of something that I knew someone was going to have a favorite
recent. It's
feature.
like 1.60.
Okay.
A couple months ago.
Yes,
Yeah,
pretty
you know
recent.
what's so cool is like in the Rust docs, it tells you that like 1.60, it puts it right next to it. I mean, there's so many nice things like that. Where if you went to it and said, "Why is this not working for me?" It has it right there in the documentation, like why it's not working for you and how you get to the version that does work. I love this thing.
Right, and a little older one is not needing to put extern crate blah everywhere.
Oh yeah.
Super
when
huge.
did that change? Because that's one of those things that I think I didn't even notice had happened. I think I just forgotten extern crate, and I was just no longer being yelled at by anybody. And
that was Rust 2018, and that was magical. Like actually, real deterministic syntax for figuring out what is coming where with respect to a crate. That was a game-changing feature for sure.
There is a little extern crate in Hubris still, Brian, so you'll have to remember at some point briefly.
You have to do it for alloc. Like if you're implementing alloc yourself, then you're kind of you have to do extern crate alloc. But that's kind of the only one I think.
You had to do it for macros for a while.
Yeah,
right. That's right. I mean, I remember doing it for macros.
Yeah, I still bump into it with some older crates that are still doing it for macros. But
Steve, did you just step on a dog toy?
Yes, I did actually. I did step on a dog toy. Yep.
I was like, this is doing nothing for my view of you having a 1940 sound effects reel. I'm waiting for like a clown horn.
For those of you who don't work at Oxide, I have this like program I run on my camera where it filters out everything behind me, so it only shows me. And so there's like a joke the other day when I had the dog, I like took that down or whatever, but it's like, oh, you can finally see what's in my apartment. So this is kind of like the opposite. Now everyone's like hearing what's in my apartment, like, mapping it out. The CIA is mapping out my apartment by the noise or whatever.
I thought it was just how excited you were about not having to write extern crate anymore.
I definitely was psyched about it for sure. I have my list is a little strange because it's a tooling feature and a not actually stabilized yet, but should be soonish kind of feature that I will enjoy a lot. And then also a ridiculous analogy back to the earlier bit about programming languages growing, what a programming language means, and Rust analyzer stuff. The thing that the biggest like small thing that's a big thing for me is RustUp can now get link.exe on its own from Microsoft instead of you needing to go download the Visual Studio tools and install that crap yourself. That is like super, super clutch for people getting started on Windows because it's like the number one step that like you get wrong and is like a big giant pain. And I don't even know how they did it because Microsoft doesn't distribute that stuff independently for whatever weird reason they do. But however they did it, I don't even care. It works now. So in the latest RustUp, if you install it on Windows, you don't need that additional download yourself. It knows how to make that happen, which is like real cool.
That's great. And actually, I never would have thought that the ability to write programs for Windows would be so load bearing for myself. But at Oxide, because of the double E's in particular, have a lot of tooling that is only on Windows. It has been, singularly valuable to be able to generate software that runs on Windows. So that's really important. That's great to hear.
Yeah, the one that I think is like super, maybe life changing is a little wrong, but I think is really awesome and is not quite stabilized yet is the x86 interrupt ABI. So Dan referenced XV6 before, but like classically, XV6 has a Perl script that generates the assembly that's the prologue and afterward for all of your interrupt handlers. And like the way that's always been done since basically the beginning of time is to always push and pop the state for every register that could be possibly mangled by your interrupt handler because you don't necessarily want to think about exactly how that's going to be cogen and all that stuff. But when you had the x86 interrupt ABI, now you can just write a normal Rust function and it will like code gen for you and it knows which registers it's using and not using. So it will only push and pop the stuff that you actually use based on the actual code gen of the stuff that you wrote. So it can actually be like more efficient and it's easier because you don't need to deal with like developing all that stuff yourself. You can just be like, this is an interrupt handler. Please make it callable appropriately for me, please. And I think it's a really cool on like a thing that you maybe assumed couldn't be done by a compiler, but like actually can. And it's both easier and better, which is like extra wild and awesome.
I'm going to actually push back on that. And the reason why is that very often in an interrupt handler, you want to manipulate the state that you're going to return to. So you actually need like a mutable reference to a data structure or something that has all the contents of the registers on it. So usually what you end up doing is creating some data structure in assembly language that you sort of push onto the top of the stack, and then you pass a pointer to that as an argument to the actual handler function. And like, I mean, I hear what you're saying, Steve, and I actually kind of apologize. I'm not trying to be a jerk about it. But I remember seeing that and I was like, oh, that's kind of nifty. And then I kind of thought about it and I was like, actually, it doesn't work for my use cases. So I've never, unfortunately, used it.
Totally.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the thing about this super low level stuff is that, like, you know, it'll be useful for some people and not for others. Like, most of my usage of that feature is like messing around with toy OSs. So I can, you know, not do those techniques. And so it's more meaningful for those kind of things, I think, than it is necessarily for everybody, for sure.
And the RFC is in the Interrupt Calling Conventions RFC. Is that right? Am I
Yeah.
looking for anything? Yeah. So that's from Philip Opperman, from who wrote the blog OS. So that's interesting. That's coming from. Cool. Those are at opposite ends. I feel of the stack, Steve, in terms of your the auto downloading.
Definitely. The silly analogy thing is I think. So it's like a little more than a programming language, and it's also to some degree about the like, does it make you a better C programmer? I think that there is a deep affinity between Rust's viewpoint on the world and the way that the Dutch build roads, which basically is like it's so okay. The way, do you know how we set speed limits in the U.S.? What we do is we send an intern out on a sunny day and we watch all the cars drive past and we knock off the top 15% and then that's the speed limit. So we like build a road and then we observe how people act and then we set the rules based on how they act, which is like a problem for safety because you get spaces that are designed purely for cars and car speeds and like all that kind of stuff and the detriment of everything else. The way the Dutch view building roads is they actually have now they have a classification system where there's 4 different kinds of roads. I won't get into that thing. But the point is they go, okay, this is a residential road and a residential street. Therefore, for safety reasons, we want cars to only go 25 miles an hour. Therefore, how do we design the road so that a driver will feel that 25 miles an hour is an appropriate speed to drive? And they don't even necessarily need to like look at the speed limit sign or like feel limited by the speed limit. It should just be the natural way that you drive. And so there's techniques and tools that you use to like make that happen when you're designing a road.
We're just going to make this road like shit scary at 30 miles an hour.
Yeah, well, you like put up a lot of trees along the side. You make the lanes narrower. Like honestly, one of the biggest differences we believe in the U.S. that you make roads safer by making them wider. Turns out that means people feel more comfortable driving faster, and it actually makes roads more dangerous. So they'll actually make very narrow roads with like speed bumps and stuff, sort of things like that. I could go on about this a long time, but this is not the Dutch road building meeting space or whatever. But Rust's attitude is like different in that. Like more similar to that in that like we're going to construct an environment where you don't have to think super hard all the time because humans are fallible and make mistakes and they get tired and they maybe drink a little bit and like, you know, all these other things that happen. And if we can construct an environment where you can do stuff and the compiler will be like, no, actually, like, you know, I'm going to nudge you towards the right thing. It means you don't need to put as much cognitive load on these things that don't matter. And you can think about your problem a little bit more as opposed to like necessarily needing to remember. Like, because when I go back to Ruby, for example, like now I'm like terrified because there's no thing that checks to tell me if what I'm doing is ridiculous. Like, when I write Rust, I'm like not thinking that much because I know that the compiler has my back, and so I rely on it like to handle all these things that I don't get in other languages because we've created this environment in this way that guides you towards an appropriate, you know, part of the space. And so I think for me, that's like it's not even so much that I like become a better programmer in other places. It's just that I realize how much other languages are like, let's widen the roads to make it safer, when that's like not actually the right way that you make things easier for programmers. Like giving people ultimate amounts of choice really ends up meaning they drown in thinking about all the details too much, whenever what we really need is to like create a thing that will get you to do the right thing without needing to think about everything all the time.
Okay, yeah. I have to jump in here because this really brings home something for me that I think is a big deal, especially in the systems programming community. There is just too much gatekeepering, and I think so much of that is based on kind of the corollary to what Steve just said, It's this idea that people can keep all that complexity in their head with languages like C and C++, and therefore they are somehow better qualified than the people who are mere mortals like myself who just can't.
Yeah, interesting.
And so therefore they look at a language like Rust and it lacks, the machismo or whatever you want to call it, of a language like C, where they're like, look, I understand undefined behavior, and I've read every word of the C11 spec, and I can apply it forwards, backwards, and sideways. Therefore, I am better at doing this than you are. And I feel like that is a huge, huge barrier to entry to, say, doing kernel development. And I'm actually really glad that Rust takes the opposite approach. They kind of like, no, let's make the roads narrower, and let's kind of, decrease the surface area with which you can cut yourself, because it turns out that's actually really important. And I think that's going to democratize things and make it easier for people to get involved.
Totally. And then the compiler can actually help you a lot. That's, to me, is like the big, I did not think, and Adam, just as you said, you didn't feel you could love again. Maybe those weren't your exact words.
No, that's how I felt. Yeah. Or even love for the first time. But yeah.
But I felt that like the compiler was just always was a burden. It was not something, was something to be dealt with, not something that could actually help me write better software. And Dan, just to your point of like, that's what Rust does. And Steve, just because you might not have seen it, Dan had a tweet during our conversation that I think is pretty interesting about when he felt the chasm was crossed. And I think it's a very good point. The hard copy publication of both the Rust programming language and Programming Rust, which that was really, and I remember buying both of those at the same time and reading both of them. And I totally agree that that's a good point about the chasm being crossed then.
When we were advocating for switching Hyperion to be written in Rust from C++ at Google, we had to write a document to justify that. I mean, that was an extraordinarily controversial decision. And so myself and the tech lead sat down and we wrote this doc. And that was one of the big data points. And I was like, look, people have committed to putting these words onto dead trees. That means that this language, I'm totally serious. I mean, that means that this language has reached a point of maturity where people are basically betting that it's not going to change that much in the future. And that means that it's going to be relatively stable for us to program against. And that was huge.
Interesting.
It also is huge for the book market, because after people saw how well both of those books did, that was also why you see this, like a year or two later, a giant explosion in the amount of books that were written on Rust, because everybody went out and bought both books. And like people looked at that and were like, oh, holy crap. Okay, this is a real thing. And therefore publishers started soliciting more authors and like all that kind of stuff. So it definitely was, totally. That's cool.
Big moment.
I'm also thinking of John's book that came out in the past year.
Yes. So good. Rust for Rustaceans.
Yeah, that one is absolutely phenomenal.
Okay, I have not read that yet, and I'm buying that now.
You definitely should.
Like sitting down for a bit, like so actually I'm actually so as everyone was talking, I switched back to listening mode for a second. I was like, well, what was like I'm trying to remember like 2018, because that's when I started writing, and or 2019, early 2019, and I think it was actually John Who's Twitch streams. I found I was like in the programming section because I was like watching just random things on Twitch, and I was like, oh, you can like watch people program. I think that's pretty cool. And then it's kind of cool to see that come full circle. I don't know if anyone else here, feel free to chime in if any of you have seen his streams, but they're pretty sweet.
I've heard many people express that opinion. I personally haven't watched them, but I really like the way that John teaches stuff, and I'm sure they're great. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't talk ordering book. I'm literally ordering the book right now. And unlike, normally I'm being a skinflint and, spending $1.98 for a used book. This one's I'm buying new, baby. This one.
You and me both, and I'm expensing it.
I'm expensing it too. That's why I'm buying it new. I feel like I can't make Pierre Lemon pay for like the 15th history of Tandem that I'm buying. But actually, the Rust for Rustaceans, I feel we can put on the company's nickel.
But like speaking of those videos, the one that I always go back to is the atomic and memory ordering one, because it is phenomenally explained. I mean, it's just that. It's like, I feel like it's really hard to get those subtle details right. So every so often I'll just like rewatch like the relevant part, and it's like so well explained, and definitely elevated my understanding of them.
And this is a Twitch stream.
Well, I think you can watch it on YouTube. Like it was definitely live stream, but you can watch like the VOD of it.
Yeah, John. He switched to doing like Crust of Rusts, and I think they're like a little shorter format, and they get re-uploaded to YouTube. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. But I think
I wouldn't call this short. It's like 2.5 hours.
Yeah,
but it has
so long.
That's awesome. That's definitely something to check out. Ben, I know you were looking to get in here a little while ago.
Yeah. Among the recent features that hit home, I feel like I have a niche one and a more common one.
When you're unmuted, we're getting some echo from you.
So in searching for UB in various published crates, I found Rayon and Protobuf were doing invalid, out of bounds, get unchecked in order to access the uninitialized region of a vec between the length and capacity. And that seemed interesting. Especially because the valid way to do this in Rust used to be a little bit complicated. At least, especially for what Rayon was doing, right? When I raised this with the Rayon authors, they said, "Oh, we actually want to have a slice to that region. We want to make sure that the lifetime is correct." And so they didn't just want to use pointer arithmetic directly from the pointer in the vec. And so there was an unstable API to do this, right? Spare capacity mud. And so I just commented on the tracking issue, and I was apparently the only one who'd really noticed that there was a lot of need for this, and it just got stabilized pretty quickly after that, which was really interesting.
That's awesome.
That must be really satisfying too, to be like, hey, I was able to kind of connect this kind of effort over here with the need over there and help make it happen.
Yeah, it was one of those experiences where I'm not sure if people knew that they needed this. And now I'm wondering how much we'll be able to get people to actually use it. But I'm hoping that people find it in the docs when they're actually looking.
And this is, you said it's, and I'm also going to reveal that I think maybe, I mean, it's a common theme that I mispronounce things, but I say mute when I read it aloud.
I do too.
You do too.
I go back and forth, honestly.
Good. Way to only be wrong half the time.
Is this like Rust's kubectl versus kubectl? Is whether
okay. Oh no. Okay, we got to talk about this. You got me started on Cuddle, and nobody else that I have talked to says that.
Says
Cuddle. Sorry, this is. I'm pulling the Unix card here. This dates back to like 1952.
Are we talking when you say? Like, I personally got you started on that because oh boy, I realized that I was in the Changelog podcast a week and a half ago, and someone said, you know what? I realized after listening to this podcast that I've been mispronouncing the word nadir, and I'm like, no, wait, actually stop. Before I think I may be mispronouncing it. How do you pronounce that word, Steve?
Nadir.
Do you? Is it because of me, or did you make?
No, that's what it looks like it should be. That's how it looks to me. I don't think I've ever heard you say it.
Okay. Good. Oh God, thank God. God bless you. If this is just part of the larger intervention around fold and map and fold, that's fine. Yeah, I do say nadir, but Adam, you say nadir.
That's right.
Sorry, Brian's in the clear here. It is nadir.
Brian's in the clear. Dan is
Nadir.
weighing. All right. Oh,
Nadir.
benevolent Dan, please weigh the hearts of those before you. All right, maybe you can pronounce it either way. So I don't know. Cuddle, I think you got to put in the other either bucket. But I do say mute when I am reading Rust aloud to myself. Adam, do you say mutt or mute?
I try to avoid it entirely by not having anything be mutable.
Oh, aren't you a saint?
Well, from the high ivory tower of Mappy Foldy.
Don't need to declare a variable as mutable if you don't declare any variables.
Exactly.
So.
Aren't you a saint? Shouldn't we all live like Adam and never use the keyword? Adam's like, is that even a keyword? I don't even know what you're talking about.
I don't know what you're talking about. It's a new language feature I've never seen. Is this what we're talking about? Did I just add this?
There is definitely this like addicting element to like start using closures and pattern matching, and it's like I wonder how few statements I can write. I'm not sure if anyone else has ever gotten that sort of power trip before, but it's definitely happened a few times, and totally unnecessary too. I'm just like, I just wonder how far we can go down this road.
I feel like Rust programmers go through these stages when they first start out. It's like you start out fighting the borrowing checker, which is something of a controversial statement, I believe, but everybody kind of goes through that. And then it's like, oh wow, traits are so cool. Let's use them everywhere.
Yes.
And then it's
Traits
like,
gone wild is a yes.
Yeah, and then it's like, what are the other neat features of the language that I can use? And then after, I don't know, I want to say like 6 months to a year, people start writing pretty reasonable code that starts to seem idiomatic. But it definitely takes a while to come up to speed and become like a proficient idiomatic Rust programmer.
Yeah, and I feel like also, at least early on, I feel I needed Cliff to bless some of the things that I was doing, as there's not a better way to do this. I feel like with Rust, Rust is constantly driving you to think, is there a better way of doing this? And it can be helpful from an experienced Rustacean to be like, actually, that's pretty good.
Yeah, there's a blog post I can't remember that's like about stages of somebody writing a programming and they show them writing like, I think it's a Lisp, and then they just learned Haskell's. They write that function this way, and then they learn Ruby and they write it that way, and it's like showing different styles of programming. But I cannot remember what the name of it is whatsoever.
There's one where like the Haskell programmer discovers point oh arithmetic and things of this nature, and then like and it's like writing Hello World or something. And then, like, at the end, they get back to the original program they'd written. And it's like, oh, wow, that really simple program is actually pretty much the way that you do it.
Totally. Hey, I want to get to a small feature that Adam I discovered in looking at what small features I might have missed just in preparation for today.
Nice.
Cargo add. Have you seen this?
Yeah, I did see that recently. And it because it adds it to the cargo toml.
Yes.
It gets the recent
version.
Best.
It is the best.
And you don't have to sully yourself with like opening an editor,
right,
or any of that stuff.
That was actually going to be on my list originally, and then I forgot because I didn't write my list down. But that's so pivotal. I've wanted it for so long. I'm so glad that ePage was able to put in so much work to make that happen because it was great.
Yeah, it's that scene, and that's like one of those things that I'm sure was like a bit gnarly to actually do, honestly, because it's kind of rewriting. It's rewriting one of the files that you got, and but that one I have not used yet because I only discovered it 15 minutes before we started, but I'm definitely putting that one on the list. Another one that for me I love, Steve, that I don't know what your take is on, links in RustDoc I actually find really valuable. That's a good one. That's not that
that's
old.
Really important and took a lot of discussion.
So good. Forgive me for interrupting. My bad.
No, I was just saying, unfortunately I need to go because it's getting a little late here.
Which is a great segue. We definitely want to wrap. I know we've gone on a bit long. The Absinthe Party. You want to?
Yeah, it's me, Zishan. I would say I think two things I would say really quick. I think you mean Kyle Kingsbury's typing the technical interview.
That's definitely related. It's not the one I'm thinking of, but it's definitely a similar one. It's very good, and everybody should go read that for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah. Anyway, I was just going to say, obviously, the Rust links as well is, to me, really huge. Because also the documentation in Rust is a big thing to make people understand, like, why this language. I think it's just another reason why it showcases, like, we're doing this. You can actually read about what's happening. There's really good docs. A lot of languages kind of suffer from really great documentation. So
they definitely do. And I'm sorry to take the wind out of your sails, but I'm glad that you're going to say the same thing. I love RustDoc. I know, Adam, you've used it a ton and made great use of it in Flutter and elsewhere. So it's a terrific attribute of the language. Well, this has been Steve. Thank you so much for joining us, Steve Lukeman.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great.
You two have obviously been in this community a lot longer than we have, and have got a lot of longevity here and great perspective. But honestly, it's been so great that Rust, I think, unlike so many things I use where updates are something to kind of dread because they're going to break things, it's like wrapped presents under the tree on Christmas morning and waking up at like 5 a.m. to go unwrap them. It's really exciting to move to the latest environment. So
it's going to be 10 years for me in December. So I'm finally going to be able to answer all those job ads that need 10 years of Rust experience.
There you go. Exactly. Nice. Awesome. Well, hey, Adam, thanks for the tweet too. That got us kickstarted on this one. And in the end of the movie, did your heart grow 3 times as large? Were you able to love?
At least.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, everyone. We're gone next week, but we'll be back in 2 weeks. I'm looking forward. We got a guest lined up for 2 weeks. So I'm looking forward to that one. All right. Thanks everyone. Talk to you later.
Peace.